Hello, and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Wajenberg. This time we will continue our reading of The Christmas Mouse by Miss Reed. Chapter 8. Upstairs in her drafty bedroom, Mary stirred. Some faint noise had penetrated the thick folds of sleep that wrapped her closely. Too tired to open her eyes or to sit up, she tried bemusedly to collect her thoughts. Could she have heard voices? She remembered that her mother was below. Perhaps she had turned on the little radio set for company, she told herself vaguely. Should she go and inspect the mousetrap? The bed was seductively warm, her limbs heavy with sleep. To stir outside was impossible. Besides, she might wake the children as well as her mother. Exhausted, she turned over, relishing the comfort of her surroundings after the bustle of the day. She began to slip back into unconsciousness, and her last remembrance of Christmas Eve was the sight of Ray Bullen's smile as he hoisted young Francis onto the bus. With a feeling of warm contentment, Mary drifted back to sleep. Old Mrs. Barry rearranged the eiderdown and put her tired head against the back of the chair. Through half-closed eyes, she surveyed her visitor. He was snoring slightly, and Mrs. Barry's maternal instinct made her want to approach the boy and quietly close his mouth. It was shameful the way some people let their children grow up to be mouth breathers, leading that way to all sorts of infections in later life, besides encouraging snoring, an unnecessary complication to a shared bedroom. Why, Mrs. Barry could recall from when she was in service many a shocking case among the gentry of couples agreeing to separate bedrooms simply because on account of snoring. However, on this present occasion, Mrs. Barry proposed to let sleeping dogs lie and snore. The child was not her permanent responsibility, but Betty Rose ought to look into the matter herself, and quickly, before the habit grew worse. Her thoughts hovered round the events that had led to the boy's presence under her roof. As far as she could judge, the boy was sensibly cared for by the Roses, who seemed to have tackled the child's grievance sympathetically. There was no doubt in Mrs. Barry's mind that the child was far better off where he was than with that fly-by-night mother of his. As for thinking that she would have him back permanently to live with her, well, that was just wishful thinking on the child's part. The local authority would not allow that, especially in the sordid circumstances in which Gloria now appeared to live and work. Stephen Aminetti, Mrs. Barry mused, her eyes still on her visitor. He would not be an easy child to bring up, with Pepe and Gloria as parents. She pitied the Roses and commended them for having the pluck to take on this pathetic outcome of a mixed marriage. He would need a firm hand and plenty of affection, too, to right the wrongs the world had done him. It could not be easy for the Roses, trying to be fair to their own two and to fit this changeling into their family. She remembered Pepe's quick jealousy of Gloria's early rivals. Plainly, this child was as quick to resentment as his father had been. She remembered the fury in those dark eyes as the boy spoke of the watches. That smoldering jealousy was a legacy from his Latin father. The thoughtlessness culminating in the flight from home, carelessness of the feelings of others, was a legacy of his casual mother. This boy was going to be a handful unless someone pulled him to his senses, thought Mrs. Barry. The Roses, respectable people though they were, might well be too gentle with the child, too ineffectual, although they apparently were doing their best to cope with this cuckoo in their nest. After all, Dick Rose left home early in the morning and was late back at night. It would fall upon Betty's shoulders, this responsibility, and with two children of her own to look after, the task might be too great for her. The child had been thinking on the wrong lines for too long, Mrs. Barry told herself. He had harbored grievances, resented authority, and indulged in self-pity. The old lady, with the strong principles instilled by her Victorian upbringing, condemned such wrong-headedness roundly. That the child was the victim to a certain extent of his circumstances, she was ready to concede, but the matter did not end there. She was heartily sick of the modern theories that condoned wrongdoing on the grounds that the wrongdoers were to be pitied and not blamed. Every individual, she firmly believed, had the freedom of choice between good and evil. If one were so wicked or thoughtless or plain stupid enough to choose to do evil, then one must be prepared to take the consequences. Children, naturally, had to be trained and helped to resist temptation and to choose the right path, but to consider them as always in the right, as so many people nowadays seem to do, was to do them a disservice, thought old Mrs. Barry. Her own children had been brought up with clear standards. Little Amelia Scott had learned the virtues easy and early from the plaque in the church extolling modesty and economy, from her upright parents, and from the strict but kindly teachings of the village school teachers, the scriptures, and the vicar of the parish. They stood her in good stead when she became a mother. She had also been told of the things which were evil: lying, boasting, stealing, cruelty, and loose living and thinking. It seemed to Mrs. Barry that in these days evil was ignored. Did modern parents and teachers think that by burying their heads in the sand evil would vanish? It had to be faced today as bravely as it always had been in the past. It was there, plain for all to see, in the deplorable accounts of murder, bloodshed, violence, and exploitation appearing in newspapers and shown on every television screen. The trouble was, thought Mrs. Barry, that too often it was shrugged off as an aspect of modern living when it should have been fought with the sword of righteousness, as she and her generation had been taught to do. It was a great pity that the seven deadly sins were not explained to the young these days. There, asleep in the chair, was the victim of one of them: envy. Had he been brought up to recognize his enemies in time, young Stephen might have been safely asleep in his own bed, instead of lying there caught in a web of his own weaving. For one had to face it, Mrs. Barry told herself, this self indulgence in envy and self pity had led the boy to positive wrongdoing. He was, in the eyes of the law and all right thinking people, a burglar and a would be thief. He was also guilty of disloyalty to the Roses, who were doing their best to bring him up, and he had completely disregarded the unhappiness this flight might cause them. All this she intended to make clear to the child as soon as he awoke. But there was a further problem, a practical one. How could she get the child home again without involving her own family or the Roses? Would they have missed him yet? Would they have rung the police? As soon as the child woke, she would try and find out the usual practice at night in the Roses' house. Would they on Christmas Eve have put the children's presents on their beds as she and Mary had done? If so, would they have noticed that the boy was missing from their son's side? All this must be discovered. Meanwhile, it was enough that the boy was resting. She too would close her eyes for a cat nap. They both needed strength to face what was before them. She dropped thankfully into a light doze. The boy woke first. Bending to feel his drying shoes, he knocked the poker into the hearth. This small clatter roused the old lady. She was alert at once, as she always was when she woke up, despite her age. The clock stood at 20 minutes past 3, and although the wind still moaned in the window, there seemed to be no sound of rain pattering on the pane. The worst of the storm appeared to be over. Mrs. Barry felt the raincoat. It was practically dry. She carefully turned the sleeves inside out and rearranged the garment so it had the full benefit of the fire's heat. It was very cozy in the room. Refreshed by her nap, the old lady looked with approval at the two red candles on the mantelpiece waiting to be lit at tea time. Today, Christmas Day, the day they had prepared for so long. The Christmas tree sparkled on the side table, the paper chains made by the little girl's nimble fingers swayed overhead, and the holly berries glimmered as brightly as the fire itself. "Merry Christmas," said Mrs. Barry to the boy. "Thank you. Merry Christmas," he responded. "It doesn't seem like Christmas somehow." "I'm not surprised. You haven't made a very good start with it, have you?" Stephen shook his head dismally. "What's more," continued the old lady, "you've put your poor foster parents and me to a mint of worry and trouble by being such a wicked, thoughtless boy." "I'm sorry," said the child. There was something perfunctory about the apology which roused Mrs. Barry's ire. "You say it," she said explosively, "but do you mean it? Do you realize all this trouble stems from your selfishness? You've been given a good home, food, warmth, clothes, comfort, taken into a decent family, and how do you repay the Roses? You ask for something you know full well is too expensive for them to give you, and then you sulk because it's not forthcoming." The boy opened his mouth as though to protest against this harangue, but Mrs. Barry swept on. "You're a thoroughly mean, nasty, mean spirited little boy, eaten up with envy and jealousy, and if you don't fight against those things, you're going to turn into a real criminal. You understand what I say?" "Yes, but I never—" "No excuses," continued Mrs. Barry briskly. "You see what your sulking and envy led you to, breaking into my house and helping yourself to my Madeira cake. Those are crimes in themselves. If you were a few years older, you could be sent to prison for doing that." The child suddenly bent forward and put his head in his hands. She could see that he was fighting tears and remained silent, watching him closely and hoping that some of her words of wisdom had hit their mark. "Have you ever had a spanking?" she asked suddenly. "Only from my real mum. She gave me a clout now and again. The Roses don't hit none of us. They're good people, better than you deserve, I suspect. I warrant if you'd been my little boy, you'd have had a few smacks by now to show you the difference between right and wrong." There was sniffing from the hidden face, but no comment. Mrs. Barry's tone softened. "What you've got to do, my child, is to start afresh. You've seen tonight where wickedness and self-pity lead you. For all we know, Mr. and Mrs. Rose are distracted, their Christmas spoiled, just because you must have your own way. And if they've told the police, then that's more people upset by your thoughtlessness. No, it's time you thought about other people instead of yourself. Time you counted your blessings instead of making yourself miserable about things you covet. No selfish person is ever happy. Remember that." The boy nodded and lifted his head from his hands. His cheeks were wet and his expression was genuinely penitent. "What we've got to do now," said Mrs. Barry, "is to put things right as quickly and quietly as we can. Tell me, do you think the Roses will have missed you?" The child looked bewildered. "They don't never look in once they've tucked us up. They calls out soft like 'good night,' then they goes to bed but don't open the door." "Not even on Christmas Eve?" asked Mrs. Barry, broaching the subject delicately. Did the child still believe in Father Christmas? He had had enough to put up with this night without any further painful disclosures. "We has our presents on the breakfast table," said Stephen, catching her meaning at once, "and our stockings at tea time when we light the candles on the Christmas tree." "So they may not know you left home?" "I don't see how they can know till morning." "I see." Mrs. Barry fell silent, turning over this fact in her mind. There seemed to be every hope that the child was right. If so, the sooner he returned and crept back to bed, the better. It seemed proper in her straightforward mind that having done wrong, the boy himself should put it right. She discounted the wrong done against herself and her own property, although she sincerely hoped that the child had learned his lesson. It was his attitude to his foster parents and to all others with whom he must work and live that must be altered. "Do you go to church?" asked Mrs. Barry. "To Sunday school. Sometimes we go to evensong." "Then you've heard about loving your neighbor?" The child looked perplexed. "Isn't it a commandment? We had to learn Oh, is it a commandment? We had to learn 10 of those once off the church wall at Sunday school." "It's another commandment. Love thy neighbor as thyself. Do you understand what it means?" The child shook his head dumbly. "Well, it sums up what I've been telling you. Think about other people and their feelings. Consider them as much as you consider yourself. Put yourself in your foster parents' place, for instance. How would you feel if the boy you looked after was so discontented that he ran away, making you feel you had let him down, when all the time you had been doing your level best to make him happy?" The boy looked at his hands and said nothing. "You're going to go back, Stephen, and get into that house as quietly as you can and get into bed. Can you do it?" "Of course, the larder window's never shut. I've been in and out dozens of times." "And you say nothing at all about what has happened tonight. That's a secret between you and me, understand?" "Yes," he whispered. "Then there's no need for anyone to be upset by this except you. I hope you'll have learned your lesson well enough to be cheerful and grateful for all that you're given and all that's done for you on Christmas Day. Do you promise that?" The boy nodded. Then his eyes grew round as he looked at Mrs. Barry in alarm. "But suppose they've found out?" "I was coming to that," the old lady said calmly. "You tell them the truth, make a clean breast of it, and say you'll never do it again, and mean it, what's more." The child's eyes grew terrified. "Tell them about coming in here? Of course. And tell them I should like to see them to explain matters." "And the police?" "If the police have been troubled, then you apologize to them too. You know what I told you. You must face the consequences, whatever they are. This night should make you think in future, my boy, and a very good thing too." She stood up and moved to the window. Outside, the rain had stopped, but a stiff wind blew the ragged clouds swiftly across a watery moon and ruffled the surface of the puddles. It was a good step to Tupp's Hill, but Stephen must be on his way shortly. Mrs. Barry was not blind to the dangers of the night for a young child walking the lanes alone, but it was a risk that had to be taken. At least the weather was kinder, the child's clothing was dry, and he had eaten and slept. He had got himself into this situation, and it would do him no harm, thought Mrs. Barry sturdily, to get himself out of it. In any case, the chance of meeting anyone abroad at 3:30 on Christmas morning was remote. Put your clothes on, directed the old lady, while I make us both a cup of coffee. She left him struggling with the toggle fastenings as she went into the kitchen. When she returned with the steaming cups of coffee, the boy was lacing his shoes. He looked up, smiling. He was so like Pepe in that fleeting moment that the years vanished for old Mrs. Barry. Lovely and warm, Stephen said approvingly, holding up his feet. Mrs. Barry handed him his cup and offered the biscuit tin. As he nibbled his ginger nut with his prominent front teeth, Stephen's resemblance to a mouse was more marked than ever. The old lady shuddered. Was her own little horror, the mouse, still at large above? Mrs. Barry craved for her bed. She was suddenly stiff and bone-tired and longed for oblivion. What a night it had been! Would the boy ever remember anything she had tried to teach him? She had her doubts, but one could only try. Who knows? Something might stick in that scatterbrained head. She motioned to the child to fetch his coat, turned the sleeves the right way out, and helped to button it to the neck. His chin was smooth and warm against her wrinkled hand and reminded her with sudden poignancy of her own sleeping grandchildren. She held him by the lapels of his raincoat and looked searchingly into the dark eyes. You remember the promise. Say nothing if they know nothing. Speak the truth if they do. And in future, do what's right and not what's wrong. The child nodded solemnly. She kissed him on the cheek, gently and without smiling. They went to the front door together. Mrs. Barry lifted a chocolate bar from the Christmas tree as she passed. Put it in your pocket. You've a long way to go and may get hungry. Straight home, mind, and into bed. Promise? Promise. She opened the door quietly. It was fairly light and the moon partially visible through fast scudding clouds. The wind lifted her hair and rustled dead leaves in the road. Goodbye then, Stephen. Don't forget what I've told you, she whispered. Goodbye, he whispered back. He stood motionless for a second, as if wondering how to make his farewell, then turned suddenly and began the long trudge home. Mrs. Barry watched him go, waiting for him to turn, perhaps, and wave, but the child did not look back, and she watched him walking steadily, left, right, until the bend in the lane hid him from her sight. Chapter 9. Back in the warm living room, Mrs. Barry found herself swaying on her feet with exhaustion. She steadied herself by holding on to the back of the armchair that had been her refuge for the night. It was years since she had felt such utter tiredness. It reminded her of the days when, as a young girl, she had helped with the mounds of washing at the vicarage. She had spent an hour or more at a time turning the heavy mangle, a monster of cast iron and solid wood, in the steamy atmosphere of the wash-house. She looked now at her downy nest of feather pillow and eider down, and knew that if she sat down, sleep would engulf her. She would be stiff when she awoke, for every nerve and sinew in her old body craved for the comfort of her bed, with room to stretch her heavy limbs. She would brave that dratted mouse. 10 chances to 1 it had made its way home again, and in any case she was so tired she would see and hear nothing once she was abed. She glanced round the room. The fire must be raked through, and the 2 telltale coffee cups washed and put away. Mrs. Barry had no intention of telling Mary and the little girls about her visitor. She put all to rights, moving slowly, her limbs leaden, her eyes half closed with fatigue. She drew back the curtains, ready for the daylight, and scanned the stormy sky. The moon was high now. Ragged clouds skimmed across its face so that the glimpses of the wet trees and shining road were intermittent. The boy should be well on his way by now. She hoped that he had avoided the great puddles that silvered his path. Those shoes would be useless in this weather. The old lady sighed and turned back to the armchair, folding the eider down neatly and putting the plump pillow across it. Gathering up her bundle, she took one last look at the scene of her encounter with young Stephen. Then, shouldering her burden, she opened the door to the staircase and went, very slowly, to her bedroom. Exhaustion dulled the terror that stirred her at the thought of the mouse still at large. Nevertheless, the old lady's heart beat faster as she quietly opened the bedroom door. The great double bed was as welcome a sight as a snug harbor to a storm-battered boat. Mary had turned down the bedclothes. They gleamed smooth and white as a snowdrift in the faint light of the moon. The room was still and cool after the living room. Mrs. Barry stood motionless, listening for any scuffle or scratching that might betray her enemy, but all was silent. She switched on the bedside lamp, which had been Mary's last year's Christmas present. It had a deep pink shade that sent a rosy glow into the room. The old lady replaced her pillow and spread out the eiderdown. Then, nerving herself, she bent down stiffly to look under the bed and see if the intruder was still there. All was as it should be. She scanned the rest of the floor and saw the mousetrap. It was empty, and the second piece of cheese was still untouched. Mrs. Barry's spirits rose a little. Surely this might mean that the mouse had returned to his own home. Either he would have been caught or the cheese would have been eaten as before. But the trap must not be left there, a danger to the grandchildren who had come running in barefoot all too soon to show their tired grandmother the things that Father Christmas had brought. Mrs. Barry took a shoe from the floor and tapped the trap smartly. The crack of the spring snapping back made her jump, but now all was safe. She could not bring herself to touch the horrid thing with her bare fingers, but prodded it to safety under the dressing table with her shoe. Sighing with relief, the old lady climbed into bed, drew up the bedclothes, and stretched luxuriously. How soon, she wondered, before Stephen Aminetti would be enjoying his bed as she did now. At any rate, he was stepping out, thought Mrs. Barry drowsily. He must be descending the long slope that led to the fold in the downs at the foot of Tupp's Hill. She knew that road well. The meadows on that southern slope had been full of cowslips when she was little. Excuse me. The meadow on that southern slope had been full of cowslips when little Amelia Scott and her friends were children. She could smell them now, warm and sweet in the May sunshine. She loved the way the pale green stalks grew from the flat rosettes of leaves, so like living pen wipers, soft and fleshy, half hidden in the springy grass of the downland. The children made cowslip balls as well as bunches to carry home. Some of the mothers made cowslip wine, and secretly young Amelia grieved to see the beautiful flowers torn from their stalks and tossed hugger-mugger into a basket. They were too precious for such rough treatment, the child felt, though she relished a sip of the wine when it was made, and now tasted it again on her tongue, the very essence of a sunny May day. On those same slopes in winter time she had tobogganed with those same friends. She remembered a childhood sweetheart, a black-haired charmer called Ned, who always led the way on his homemade sled and feared nothing. He scorned gloves, hats, and all the other winter comforts in which loving mothers wrapped their offspring, but rushed bareheaded down the slope, his eyes sparkling, cheeks red, and the breath blowing behind him in streamers. Poor Ned, so full of life and courage. He had gone to a water-filled grave in Flanders mud before he was 20 years old. But the memory of that vivacious child remained with old Mrs. Barry as freshly as if it were yesterday that they had swept down the snowy slope together. In those days, a tumble-down shack had stood by a small rivulet at the bottom of the slope. It was inhabited by a poor, silly old man called locally Dirty Dick. He did not seem to have any steady occupation, although he sometimes did a little field work in the summer months, singling turnips, picking the wild oats from the farmer's standing corn, or making himself useful when the time came round for picking apples or plums in the local orchards. The children were warned not to speak to him. Years before, it seemed, he had been taken to court in Caxley for some indecent conduct, and this was never forgotten. The rougher children shouted names after him and threw stones. The more gently nurtured, such as little Amelia, simply hurried by. "You're not to take any notice of him," her mother had said warningly. "Why not?" A look of the utmost primness swept over her mother's countenance. "He is sometimes a very rude old man," she said in a shocked voice. Amelia inquired no further. His end had been tragic, she remembered. He had been found, face downwards, in the little brook, a saucepan in his clenched hand, as he had dipped water to boil for his morning tea. The doctor had said his heart must have failed suddenly. The old man had toppled into the stream and drowned in less than 8 inches of spring floodwater. Young Amelia had heard of his death with mingled horror and relief. Now she need never fear to pass that hut, dreading the meeting with a very rude old man. whose death, nevertheless, seemed unnecessarily cruel to the soft hearted child. Well, Stephen Aminetti would have no dirty Dick to fear on his homeward way, but he would have the avenue to traverse, a frightening tunnel of dark trees lining the road for a matter of 100 yards across the valley. Even on the hottest day, the air blew chill in those deep shadows. On a night like this, Mrs. Barry knew well, the wind would clatter in the branches and whistle eerily. Stephen would need to keep a stout heart to hold the bogies at bay as he ran the gauntlet in those age old trees. But by then he would be within half a mile of his home, up the steep short hill that overlooked the valley. A small estate of council houses had been built at Tupp's Hill some 30 years ago, and though the architecture was grimly functional and the concrete paths gave an institutional look to the area, yet most of the tenants, countrymen all, had softened the bleakness with climbing wall plants and plenty of bright annuals in the borders. The hillside position, too, was enviable. The houses commanded wide views over agricultural land, the gardens were large, and with unusual foresight, the council had provided a row of garages for their tenants so that unsightly old shabby cars were screened from view. Those lucky enough to get a Tupp's Hill house were envied by their brethren. If only Stephen could get in unobserved. Mrs. Barry stirred restlessly, considering her visitor's chances of escaping detection. The poor little mouse, poor little Christmas mouse. Dear God, please let him creep into his home safely. And then she froze. Somewhere in the darkness close at hand, something rustled. Her first instinct was to snatch the eider down from the bed and bolt. She would fly downstairs again to the safety of the armchair and there await the dawn and Mary's coming to her rescue. But several things kept her quaking in the warm bed. Extreme tiredness was one. Her fear that she would rouse the sleeping household was another. The day ahead would be a busy one, and Mary needed all the rest she could get. This was something she must face alone. Mrs. Barry tried to pinpoint the position of the rustling. A faint squeaking noise made her flesh prickle. What could it be? It did not sound like the squeak of a mouse. The noise came from the right, by the windowsill. Could the wretched creature be on the windowsill? Could it be scrabbling with its tiny claws on the glass of the window pane in its efforts to escape? Mrs. Barry shuddered at the very thought of confronting it, of seeing its dreadful stringy tail, its beady eyes, and its more than likely darting to cover into some inaccessible spot in the bedroom. All her old terrors came flying back like a flock of evil black birds to harass her. There was still that ghastly dead mouse in her aunt's flour keg, the next one with all the pink hairless babies in her father's toolbox, the one the boys had killed in the school lobby, the pair that sat up home once under the kitchen sink, and all those numberless little horrors that Pepe the cat used to bring in, alive and dead, to scare her out of her wits. But somehow there had always been someone to cope with them. Dear Stanley, or Bertie, or brave Mary, or some good neighbor would come to her aid. Now, in the darkness, she must manage alone. She took a deep breath and cautiously edged her tired old legs out of bed. She must switch on the bedside lamp again and risk the fact that it might stampede the mouse into flight. Her fingers shook as she groped for the switch. Once more, rosy light bathed the room. Sitting on the side of the bed, Mrs. Barry turned round to face the direction of the rustling, fear drying her throat. There was no sound now. Even the wind seemed to have dropped. Silence engulfed the room. Could she have been mistaken? Could the squeaking noise have been caused by the thorns of the rose bush growing against the wall? Hope rose. Immediately it fell again, for there, crouched in a corner of the windowsill, was a tiny, furry ball. Old Mrs. Barry put a shaking hand over her mouth to quell any scream that might escape her unawares. Motionless, she gazed at the mouse. Motionless, the mouse gazed back. Thus transfixed they remained. Only the old lady's heavy breathing broke the silence that engulfed them. After some minutes, the mouse lifted its head and snuffed the air. Mrs. Barry caught her breath. It was so like Stephen Aminetti as he had sprawled in the armchair, head back, with his pointed pink nose in the air. She watched the mouse fascinated. It seemed oblivious of danger and sat up on its haunches to wash its face. Its bright eyes, as dark and lustrous as Stephen's, moved restlessly as it went about its toilette. Its minute pink paws reminded Mrs. Barry of the tiny pink shells she had treasured as a child after a Sunday school outing to the sea. It was incredible to think that something so small could lead such a full, busy life, foraging, making a home, keeping itself and its family fed and cleaned. And that was the life it must return to, thought Mrs. Barry firmly. It must go back as surely as Stephen had to resume its proper existence. Strange that two creatures so alike in looks should flee their homes and take refuge on the same night, uninvited, under her roof. The best way to send this little scrap on its homeward journey would be to open the window and hope that it would negotiate the frail stairway of the rose bush trained against the wall, and so return to earth. But the thought of reaching over the mouse to struggle with the window catch needed all the courage that the old lady could muster, and she sat on the bed, summoning her strength. The longer she watched, the less frightened she became. It was almost like watching Stephen Aminetti all over again, a fugitive, defenseless, young, and infinitely pathetic thing. They both needed help and guidance to get them home. She took a deep breath and stood up. The bed spring squeaked, but the mouse did not take flight. It stopped washing its whiskers and gazed warily about. Mrs. Barry, gritting her teeth, approached slowly. The mouse shrank down into a little furry ball, reminding Mrs. Barry of a fur button on a jacket of her mother's. Quietly, she leaned over the sill and lifted the window catch. The mouse remained motionless. The cold air blew in, stirring the curtain and bringing a breath of rain-washed leaves and damp earth. Mrs. Barry retreated to the bed again to watch developments. She sat there for a full minute before her captive made a move. It raised its quivering pink nose and then, in one bound, darted over the window frame, dragging its pink tail behind it. As it vanished, Mrs. Barry hurried to the window to watch its departure. It was light enough to see its tiny shape undulating down the crisscross of thorny rose stems, but when it finally reached the bare earth, it was invisible to the old lady's eyes. She closed the window carefully, sighed with relief and exhaustion, and clambered once more into bed. Her two unbidden visitors, her Christmas mice, had gone. Now, at long last, she could rest. Below the row of wallflower plants, close to the bricks of the cottage, scurried the mouse, nose twitching. It ran across the garden path, dived under the cotton Easter bush, scrambled up the mossy step by the disused well, turned sharp right through the jungle of dried grass beside the garden shed, and streaked unerringly to the third hawthorn bush in the hedge. There at the foot, screened by ground ivy, was its hole. It dived down into the loose sandy earth, snuffling the dear frosty smell of mouse family and mouse food. Home at last. At much the same time, Stephen Aminetti lowered himself carefully through the pantry window. The house was as silent as the grave, and dark inside after the pallid glimmer of the moon's rays. With infinite caution, he undid the pantry door and closed it behind him. For greater quietness, he removed his wet shoes, and carrying them in one hand, he ascended the staircase. The smells of home were all about him. There was a faint whiff of the mince pies Mrs. Rose had made on Christmas Eve, mingled from the open door of the bathroom with the sharp, clean smell of Lifebuoy soap. Noiselessly, he turned the handle of the bedroom door. Now there was a stronger scent, of the liniment that Jim used after football, boasting as he rubbed of his swelling muscles. The older boy lay curled up on his side of the bed, dead to the world. It would take more than Stephen's entry into the room to wake him. Peeling off his clothes, Stephen longed for bed, for sleep, for forgetfulness. Within 3 minutes, he was lying beside the sleeping boy, his head a jumble of cake tins, fierce old ladies, storm weather, and sore feet. And somewhere, beyond the muddle, a hazy remembrance of a promise to keep. And we'll find out what Christmas Day is like for Mrs. Barry next time.